The Dichotomy of Leadership by Jocko Willink and Leif Babin. The street ahead had gone eerily silent. You know that kind of quiet that actually feels loud? The kind that makes every nerve in your body stand at attention? One moment Ramadi was humming with the ordinary sounds of city life. The next it felt like someone had hit the mute button. The locals had disappeared into thin air. For the patrol of Navy SEALs and Iraqi soldiers moving through that narrow corridor, the message was crystal clear: something bad was about to happen. A voice crackled over the radio, oddly calm, almost casual, delivering their dark running joke, "Stand by to get some." Then all hell broke loose. Bullets, dozens or maybe hundreds of them, tore through the air with that distinctive supersonic crack, punching holes in the concrete walls around them. It sounded like the world itself was being torn apart by giant jackhammers. They'd walked straight into a carefully planned ambush, caught in a crossfire of machine gun fire coming from every direction. There was literally nowhere to hide. The guy leading this patrol, he was the most junior officer in the platoon. This was his operation, his call to make. And just a few feet behind him stood his boss, Leif Babin, the platoon commander. Every instinct Babin had was screaming at him to take over, to start barking orders, to use his experience to get everyone out alive. But he held back. He had to trust the young leader he'd spent months training. In this moment, he had to be a follower. This is where leadership gets really interesting, on that razor's edge where every fiber of your being is pulling you in completely opposite directions at the same time. When should you take charge, and when should you step back? When do you push forward aggressively, and when do you pump the brakes? When do you hold someone's feet to the fire, and when do you put your arm around their shoulder? These aren't simple questions with neat, tidy answers. They're paradoxes. They're what the authors call dichotomies. Today we're diving into a book that tackles this messy, complicated, and honestly beautiful reality of what it means to lead people. It's called The Dichotomy of Leadership, written by two of the most battle-tested leaders of our generation, Jocko Willink and Leif Babin. These guys led Task Unit Bruiser, the most decorated special operations unit of the Iraq War, through the absolute chaos of the Battle of Ramadi. Their first book, Extreme Ownership, taught us that leaders are responsible for everything in their world. But what they discovered afterward, and what makes this book so powerful, is that real leadership isn't about living at the extremes, it's about finding balance. By the time we're done here, you'll understand the hidden tensions that pull every leader in different directions, and you'll have a roadmap for navigating them. You'll learn that being a great leader doesn't mean being just one thing. It means holding two opposite truths at the same time. You have to master the dichotomy. To really get this idea of balance, we need to start where the stakes couldn't be higher. Imagine you're responsible for a team of people. You genuinely care about them. You want to protect them. Now imagine your job requires you to send them into situations where some of them might not make it home. This is what Jocko Willink calls the ultimate dichotomy of leadership. You have to care about your people more than almost anything in the world, and at the same time, you have to be willing to lead them on missions that could cost them their lives. One day, one of Jocko's young SEALs took a bullet to the leg during a fierce firefight. The round was massive, armor-piercing, and it absolutely devastated his thigh. Lying there in the field hospital, groggy from morphine, this young man grabbed Jocko's hand, pulled him close, and whispered, "Sir, let me stay. Please, don't make me go home. I'll do anything. Just let me stay with the task unit." He wasn't scared of losing his leg. He was terrified of leaving his brothers. This is the kind of bond that forms in elite teams. These guys weren't just coworkers or even friends. They were family. And Jocko felt responsible for them not just as their commander, but almost like a father would. He wanted nothing more than to keep them all safe. But his mission was to help win the battle for Ramadi, one of the most violent and dangerous places on Earth. He couldn't keep his men safe by keeping them locked up on base. He had to send them out, day after day, into incredibly dangerous situations. Eventually, that danger caught up with them. During a massive firefight, a brilliant young SEAL named Mark Lee was killed while heroically protecting his teammates from enemy fire. Just hours earlier, another SEAL, Ryan Job, had been critically wounded. The weight of that loss was crushing. Leif Babin, who was Mark's platoon commander, came to Jocko with his soul in turmoil. "I feel like I made the wrong decision," he said, wishing desperately that he could rewind time and make a different call. He was the one who'd led them back into the fight. Jocko looked at him and said something that cut right to the heart of leadership. "No, Leif, there was no decision to make. Their army brothers were in a massive fight and desperately needed help. To sit back and do nothing wasn't an option. It wasn't who they were. As a leader, you care deeply for your people, but you still have to accomplish the mission, and that involves risk." This is the first and probably the hardest balance to strike. It shows up in the business world too. A manager might care deeply about their employees, real people with families and bills to pay. But if the company is going under, that same manager might have to make the brutal decision to lay some people off to save everyone else's jobs. If you care too much about individuals, you might fail to make the tough calls necessary for the team's survival. But if you care too much about the mission alone, you might burn people out, treat them like they're disposable, and destroy the trust that actually holds teams together. A good leader doesn't camp out at either extreme. They walk that tightrope right down the middle. But this balancing act goes even deeper. The author's first book taught people about extreme ownership, the idea that you, as the leader, are responsible for absolutely everything. It's a powerful concept, but they soon discovered that leaders were taking it way too far. Jocko tells this great story from his first combat deployment to Iraq back in 2003. He was a new platoon commander, and because his team hadn't seen combat before, he got deep in the weeds of every single mission plan. He planned the routes, picked the breach points, figured out the vehicle configurations. He owned everything. And he was constantly frustrated because his junior leaders weren't stepping up and showing initiative. Then one day they got assigned 4 different missions all at once. There was literally no way Jocko could plan them all himself. He had no choice but to assign each mission to a different junior leader and basically say, "Figure it out," and come back with a plan. The results blew his mind. These junior leaders didn't just create decent plans, they came up with fresh, innovative approaches he hadn't even considered. They took complete ownership. Jocko had this light bulb moment. The reason they hadn't stepped up before was because he'd never given them room to. By hoarding all the ownership for himself, he'd left them with nothing to actually own. This is the dichotomy of own it all, but empower others. A leader has to take ultimate responsibility, but they also have to give ownership away. This is what they call decentralized command. If you micromanage every little thing, your team basically becomes a bunch of robots who only move when you tell them to. Initiative dies. But if you're too hands-off, the team can lose focus, with people running in completely different directions, sometimes even working against each other. Finding the sweet spot means giving your team what's called commander's intent, the why behind the mission, and then trusting them to figure out the how. You have to give them space to actually lead. The goal of a truly great leader, as Jocko puts it, should be to work themselves out of a job. Of course, sometimes you do have to step in. A leader can't be a complete pushover. They have to know when to draw a hard line. Early in their deployment to Ramadi, Jocko realized that his SEALs needed to be able to talk directly to the Army and Marine units they fought alongside. This meant everyone, not just the designated radio guys, had to learn how to program their own radios, which is actually pretty complex and tedious. He gave the order, but a few days later, he could tell from the blank stares around the room that most of the guys hadn't actually done it. They were swamped, and it didn't seem like the most pressing thing. Jocko didn't yell or make a big scene. He simply walked over to one of the new guys, took his radio, wiped its memory clean, and handed it back. "Reprogram that," he said. The SEAL just stared back at him, completely unable to do it. Jocko then made it crystal clear. If you don't know how to program your radio by the next mission, you're staying on base. Message received. By the next operation, every single person knew how to program their radios. That skill would later save lives, including during one intense firefight where Leif Babin was able to quickly switch frequencies and call off friendly fire from a U.S. tank that was shooting directly over his team's position. Jocko stood firm because this wasn't just about following rules, it was critical to the mission and to keeping his men alive. But here's the thing, a leader can't be a hard-ass about everything. This is the dichotomy of being resolute but not overbearing. You have to figure out which battles are actually worth fighting. In the SEAL teams, there was this tradition of wearing custom patches on uniforms, platoon logos, funny sayings, things that built camaraderie and team identity. When Task Unit Bruiser was training to deploy, a lot of these patches were, let's just say, unprofessional, and sometimes downright crude. Jocko knew this would create a terrible first impression with the Army and Marine units they needed to work with and earn trust from, so he dropped the hammer. No more patches. But Leif and the other platoon commander, Seth Stone, felt strongly that having a unified task unit patch was actually important for morale and unit cohesion. So, working in secret, they designed 2 patches and had them made for everyone in the unit except for Jocko and his immediate staff. Whenever they went out on a mission where Jocko wasn't present, the call would go out over the radio, patches on. Of course, it was only a matter of time before they got busted. A photographer embedded with an Army unit took pictures of the SEALs in action, and those forbidden patches were right there, clear as day. Leif braced himself for Jocko's anger. But it never came. Jocko saw the photos and let it slide. He recognized that the crude, unprofessional patches were gone. In their place, everyone wore the same, tasteful task unit patch. It was actually a source of pride and brought the unit together. In this case, Jocko recognized that being flexible mattered more than being rigid. He chose to spend his leadership capital on things that truly mattered, like being able to program radios in a firefight, not on things that were strategically unimportant. A good leader knows when to hold the line and when to let it bend a little. This delicate balance also applies to developing people. One of the core mantras of extreme ownership is, there are no bad teams, only bad leaders. This means a leader has to take responsibility when someone on their team is underperforming and do absolutely everything they can to coach, train, and mentor them. Most people who aren't performing well don't need to be fired, they need to be led better. But what happens when you've done everything humanly possible and they're still not cutting it? This is the dichotomy of when to mentor, when to fire. During their pre-deployment training, Charlie Platoon had a new SEAL they called Rock, who was really struggling. He was a hard worker and genuinely a great guy, but when things got intense in high-pressure training scenarios, he would either freeze up or make dangerous decisions. Leif and his senior enlisted leader, Tony, worked with him relentlessly. They gave him extra coaching, paired him with mentors, and spent their weekends training him while everyone else was relaxing. Leif felt protective. This was one of his guys. But as the training ramped up and involved live ammunition in tight spaces, Rock wasn't just struggling anymore. He was becoming a serious danger to himself and everyone around him. Leif went to Jocko, clearly torn up about it. He knew that if they cut Rock from the platoon, they wouldn't get a replacement. They'd be one man short for the entire deployment. Are there other jobs he could do? Jocko asked, pushing Leif to explore every possible option. But deep down, Leif knew that even in a less critical role, Rock would inevitably end up in situations he couldn't handle. It wasn't just about the team's performance anymore, it was also about Rock himself. Putting him in combat situations so far beyond his capabilities, where a bad split-second decision could get someone killed, would be a burden Rock would carry for the rest of his life. They'd done everything they could. They'd mentored, coached, and supported. Now it was time to make the hard call. They had to let him go. It's one of the toughest decisions any leader has to make. But a leader's loyalty can't be to just one individual, it has to be to the entire team and the mission. If you wait too long to remove someone who's holding everyone back, you're actually failing the whole team. But if you're too quick to cut people loose, you fail as a leader by not giving people a real chance to grow. You have to do absolutely everything you can to help them until you genuinely can't anymore. That's the balance. The mission itself creates constant tension for leaders too. You have to train hard, but you also have to train smart. After Ramadi, Jocko ran the training program for all West Coast SEALs. His training scenarios became legendary for being incredibly difficult and chaotic, designed to mirror the brutal reality of actual combat. In one exercise, a platoon was failing miserably because everything depended entirely on one dominant leader, a chief they called Big Walt. So Jocko gave his instructors a specific order: put him down. In the next scenario, a simulated firefight erupted, and an instructor ran up to Big Walt and told him he was killed. Instantly, the entire platoon fell apart like a house of cards. The next person in the leadership chain was completely overwhelmed. Nobody knew what to do. They were paralyzed. The training was hard, maybe too hard. The team was so crushed that they'd stopped learning and were just floundering. Jocko recognized this. Training can't be so brutal that it destroys people instead of building them up. So he did something unusual. He suddenly yelled out, "Big Walt, you're alive!" Like a phoenix rising from the ashes, Big Walt stood up and, with just a few simple, clear commands, got the entire platoon organized, consolidated, and moving to safety. The lesson was incredibly powerful. The other leaders didn't just experience failure, they got to see what success actually looked like. They watched how a single, decisive leader could bring order to complete chaos. The training was still hard, but Jocko had balanced it by making it productive. This balance applies in every direction. Leaders need to be aggressive, but not reckless. They should have what the authors call a default aggressive mindset, proactively solving problems, instead of waiting around to be told what to do. But aggression without thought is just stupidity. During the Battle of Ramadi, the brigade commander asked Jocko if Task Unit Bruiser could help take out enemy mortar teams operating in an area called Sea Lake. The default answer for any SEAL unit is always yes. They're wired to be aggressive. They want the mission. But when Leif and his team really analyzed this particular mission, they found some serious problems. The enemy had no predictable pattern. The terrain didn't offer any good positions for their snipers to work from, and the only road in and out was extremely dangerous, absolutely littered with IEDs. The conclusion was pretty clear. This mission had a very low chance of success, but an extremely high risk to the SEALs and the Army soldiers who'd have to support them. As much as they wanted to help, the risk just wasn't worth the potential reward. Jocko went back to the brigade commander, walked through their analysis, and respectfully declined the mission. That's not being passive or scared. That's being smart. It's balancing the natural desire to be aggressive with a clear-eyed, honest assessment of the actual risks involved. This idea of finding middle ground touches absolutely everything a leader does. You need to be disciplined but not rigid. Standard operating procedures, what they call SOPs, are crucial. They create discipline and make teams efficient. But if a leader becomes a complete slave to the procedures, they lose their ability to think and adapt. Seth Stone, the other platoon commander in Task Unit Bruiser, learned this lesson hard during training. He was following the SOPs for reacting to an ambush so perfectly, so by the book, that he ended up in this position where he was basically staring at a dirt wall, completely unable to see the battlefield or actually lead his guys. Jocko had to pull him aside and coach him. "You're the leader. You need to move around. Find a way to see what's happening." Seth had this realization that SOPs aren't laws carved in stone, they're guidelines. A leader needs the discipline to follow the plan, but also the freedom to deviate from it when the situation on the ground demands something different. Finally, a leader has to learn to balance themselves. This is maybe the most personal and challenging set of dichotomies. You have to be a leader, but also a follower. This doesn't just mean following your own boss. It means being willing to follow the best idea in the room, even if it comes from your most junior team member. On one operation, Leif Babin had a plan to set up a sniper overwatch position in a certain building. But his lead sniper, Chris Kyle, disagreed. He thought a completely different building offered a much better tactical advantage. Leif was in charge. He outranked Chris by a mile. He could have easily overruled him, and nobody would have questioned it. But he recognized that Chris had way more experience with this specific type of sniper mission. He checked his ego at the door and said, "All right, let's go with your plan." Chris's recommendation turned out to be absolutely spot on. They ended up in the perfect position and disrupted dozens of enemy attacks. If Leif had insisted on his own plan just because he was the leader, the mission would have been far less successful. A good leader doesn't need to have all the answers rattling around in their own head. They just need to be humble enough to follow the person who does have the answer. You have to be humble but not passive. Humility is probably the most important quality any leader can have. It lets you actually listen to people, to keep learning, and to build real trust. But humility doesn't mean you become a doormat and accept orders you know are completely wrong or will genuinely harm your team. When the High Command in Iraq issued this directive that SEALs had to operate with a 7-to-1 ratio of Iraqi soldiers to Americans, Jocko immediately knew it would be a death sentence in Ramadi. A tiny team of 3 SEALs with 21 unreliable Iraqi soldiers would get overrun quickly in that environment. He'd been humble and supportive of his chain of command on pretty much everything, but this was one of those times when he had to push back hard. He couldn't just roll over. Because he'd built up so much trust and credibility by being a good follower 99% of the time, when he finally did push back on something, his leaders actually listened. They granted him an exception. He picked his battle carefully, and he won it. And lastly, a leader has to be focused, but detached. You need to pay attention to the details, but you can't get so lost in the weeds that you lose sight of the big picture. Leif learned this during a chaotic house raid. After breaching through a door, an Iraqi soldier with him accidentally fired his AK-47 inside this tiny room. Everyone immediately assumed they were taking fire from the next room over. They were literally about to throw a grenade in there, where an innocent family was actually hiding. But Leif, as the leader, took just one physical step back from what they call the, quote, shooter train. He detached himself from the immediate action. And in that brief moment, he was able to see the bigger picture. The panicked look on the Iraqi soldier's face, the bullet holes in the floor right at his feet. He immediately called off the grenade, preventing what would have been a horrible tragedy. Being focused means you're in the fight, down in the details. Being detached means you're leading the fight, seeing the whole picture. A leader has to constantly zoom in and zoom out, paying close attention to what's happening right in front of them, while never losing sight of the broader strategic mission. That's the final, and maybe the most constant balancing act of all. So what's the real takeaway from all of this? What's the secret that Jocko Willink and Leif Babin are really trying to share with us? I think it's this: leadership is not some fixed state you achieve. It's not a rigid set of rules you can memorize and check off. It's more like a dance. It's this constant, fluid adjustment between two opposing forces. The greatest leaders aren't the ones who are the most aggressive, or the most humble, or the most disciplined in isolation. They're the ones who are the most balanced, the ones who can hold multiple truths at once. This book, The Dichotomy of Leadership, is so powerful because it actually acknowledges the gray areas of real life. The first book, Extreme Ownership, gave us the foundation. Take complete responsibility for everything. It's a simple, powerful, black and white principle. But leadership in the real world is almost never black and white. It's messy, it's full of contradictions and paradoxes. This book gives us the courage to step into that messiness and navigate it with actual wisdom, instead of just rigid rules. The most profound lesson for me is this idea that your greatest strength can actually become your greatest weakness if you take it too far. Are you a leader who's incredibly detail-oriented? That's genuinely a strength. But if you're not careful, it'll morph into micromanagement, and you'll end up crushing your team's initiative and creativity. Are you a leader who deeply cares about your people? That's beautiful and absolutely essential. But if you don't balance it with the needs of the mission and the bigger picture, you might fail to make the hard calls that are actually necessary to protect the entire team in the long run. The path to becoming a better leader, then, isn't really about learning some fancy new skill or technique. It's about developing a new level of awareness. It's about learning to feel when you're drifting out of balance, like a tightrope walker, sensing they're leaning too far one way. So how can you start applying this stuff today? Here are a couple of simple things to think about. First, the next time you have a disagreement with your boss or a teacher or a coach, ask yourself this question: is this the hill I need to die on? Is this one of those moments where you genuinely need to be resolute and push back because it's critical to the mission or your values? Or is this a moment to be humble, to follow their lead, and to build up that leadership capital that you can spend later when something truly important is on the line? Just asking yourself that question will help you find the balance between being humble and not being a passive pushover. Second, think about the people on your team, whether that's a sports team, a project group at school, or even just your friend group. Is there someone who's really struggling? Your first instinct as a leader should be to help them, to mentor them, to do everything in your power to bring them up. But you also have to ask yourself the hard question: is my effort to help this one person actually holding everyone else back? You can't give up on people too quickly, but you also can't let the whole team suffer indefinitely. That's the dichotomy of mentoring versus making the tough call to remove someone, and it applies to way more areas of life than you might think. Ultimately, this book teaches us that leadership is really a journey of constant self-correction. You'll lean too far one way, and you'll feel the team start to drift or struggle. Then you correct, sometimes gently, sometimes more dramatically, and bring things back towards center. It's not about being perfect or getting it right every single time. It's about being aware enough to notice when you're off balance, and having the humility to admit it, and the courage to adjust your approach. That's the real art of leadership. That's the dichotomy. That was a summary of The Dichotomy of Leadership by Jocko Willink and Leif Babin. We've explored the core ideas today, but a summary is kind of like looking at a map of some beautiful country you've never visited. The map can show you where the mountains are and where the roads go, but it can't give you the feeling of actually being there, the sun on your face, or the sound of wind in the trees. The real magic happens when you actually travel there yourself. If any of the stories or ideas we've talked about today have sparked something in you, I really encourage you to pick up a copy of the book. Reading it isn't just about absorbing information. It's an experience that can genuinely shift how you see your role as a leader, a teammate, and just as a person navigating life. The link to the book is right there in the description below. And if you found value in what we explored today, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss when we dive into another book that might just change how you see the world. Let's keep learning and growing together.